Alright, hello again. This is Jeff Scott of Blackhawk Technical College, and I've been going over chapters 1 through 11 of Sam's Teach Yourself, AngularJS, JavaScript, and jQuery all in one. This is the book that's going to be used for both the 152, 164 Design and Implementation Projects class and the 152, 167 Ajax and JavaScript Website Development class. I'm on Chapter 10 right now, as you can see, and this is entitled Dynamically Accessing and Manipulating Web Pages with JavaScript and jQuery. So, among other things, we will discuss in here tracking the mouse position and other information, manipulating the size and other attributes of page elements, how to show and hide elements dynamically, how to layer page elements, how to dynamically create DOM elements and add them to web pages, how to add and remove jQuery classes or classes in jQuery, and how to modify the layout of a web page. And the author mentions this is a big one. It's not so much that it's long, but there's a lot of information in it. It says, so far, you've been given most of the tools you need to implement highly dynamic and interactive web pages. In this lesson, you take the next step and learn how to use these tools and some new ones to access information about web pages. Okay? All right. So, one of the core fundamentals of both jQuery and JavaScript is access to DOM objects that represent elements on a web page. So, to get mouse position, as they mentioned right here, all right, the coordinates, the event object attributes that you will use to specify the mouse position are shown on the screen here, and also in your book in the middle of page 270. And they give some examples. It says the following code shows an example of getting the mouse coordinates from an object named E and applying them to a string variable. Actually, it's 3 different string variables. All right. Several HTML elements, especially input elements, have values associated with them. It's a simple matter in both jQuery and JavaScript to access the value of those elements. Now, this is really important, because when you want to be able to go and pull information off that either a user has entered into a web page or happens to be on a web page, maybe that they didn't even answer it. All right, you can use value with JavaScript and the .val method with jQuery. And the .val method can be used to either retrieve or to set a value. So in this case, we're literally setting the value. All right. We're setting the value of text input, something with the ID of text input. We're setting its value to 5. Here we're grabbing that value and we're assigning it to a variable called value. All right. So as mentioned here in the middle of page 271, DOM objects provide direct access to DOM object attributes and the DOM element properties of the HTML elements they represent. It says this is not reasonable in jQuery because jQuery objects often represent multiple elements with varying attributes. So, for that reason, jQuery provides both an attr and a prop method, all right, that can be used to both get and set the properties of different elements. And here are some examples. As it says, this example right here gets the source value for the specific element with an ID of banner image. Why? Again, because you can see that it's on the right-hand side of the equal sign. Then here, there is no equal sign, but we're using this statement to set the source attribute for all image elements. All right? And so that's the attr. The prop property, or the prop method as it says, allows you to specify the property to get the current value and an optional value to set the current value. So in the example that you see right here, this code gets the checked state of an element with an ID, a first checkbox. This, again, there's an equal sign there, and when it's on the right-hand side of an equal sign, you're using it to set a value, or to get a value rather. And here we're setting a value. So as it says, this will set the checked value of all input elements to true. Now notice, it's kind of important here, the note here that's on the top of page 272. The only difference between a property and an attribute in jQuery is that attributes are values that define the HTML structure, and properties are values that define the dynamic structure of an object. All right, and they give an example right here where they say type is an attribute and checked is a property. All right. Another important aspect of dynamic web programming is the dynamic manipulation of CSS. JavaScript allows you to access CSS properties via the style attribute of the DOM object. For example, they say you can get color and background color of an element from the DOM using code such as this. There's a bunch of other properties. Here they're showing position and top and left. jQuery, as mentioned there, makes it extremely easy to get these properties. You use the .css. All right. This code, as it says, retrieves the cursor CSS property of an element. This one sets the property. As mentioned here, the CSS method also allows you to pass a map object with properties and values, which allows you to do a lot of different things at the same time. Another important aspect as mentioned here when dynamically working with HTML elements is the ability to get and set the size of an element. And you can see the major object methods in jQuery used here to get and set element size. And in addition to size, it says you often need to get position. When you work with HTML elements, there are two types of positions. The first is the position relative to the full document. The second is relative to the HTML element that acts as basically its offset parent. And that is, it says there, depend on the positioning here. So jQuery provides a position method that you can use to get the position relative to the offset parent. And then there's an offset method that provides the position relative to the document. So they give some examples down here, or here on the middle of the page, as you can see, and it says the following code will get the number of pixels from the top and the left of the document and the offset parent to an element with an ID of my element. All right? I guess the big thing is, and we've talked about this before several times, and that is good, bad, or indifferent. There are loads of ways of doing the same thing. And as always, the author is showing you some of those ways. All right? And I'm not going to say that one way is better than another way, because what happens is over time, you will decide which way makes the most sense to you, and that basically, that'll be the way that you use. The simplest way to get classes associated with an HTML element is to use the class name attribute of the DOM object. So the example that they show here says the following example shows how to get the class name attribute of an element with an ID of main list using jQuery. All right. More important stuff here, browser and screen size and color information. So as it says, I'm going to pause for a second because my clock is making noise here. All right. So they mention here again, an important part of dynamically manipulating web pages is the capability to access information regarding the screen and regarding the browser. All right. And they'll talk about that here, and also on talking a little bit about color information. So you can access screen size using the screen object in JavaScript. That provides height and width attributes, and you can see the top example there. To get the colors supported by the screen and thus the web browser, you can use the color depth attribute. So they give you an example of that right here. Finally, browser dimensions can be accessed from the inner width, inner height, and outer height attributes of the window object available in JavaScript. Inner height and inner width refer to actual area available on the web page. Outer width and outer height refer to the total area, including the browser menu, any borders you might have, and any browsers you might have. And there's an example of that here. All right, the first try it yourself example that we see in here says now it's time to put everything together. In this example, we build a basic web page with some different HTML elements. One of the elements will be a div that displays screen, browser, mouse, and element information and is updated with each movement of the mouse. The code is in listings 10.11, or 10.1, 10.2, and 10.3, which are on pages 279, 280, and 281. It says it may look like a lot of code at first, but it's pretty basic and will help you to get information from jQuery and JavaScript. So they mention here in step 3, it says there are two main sections here. The first part defines several types of elements. The first part defines several types of elements for you to interact with, and the second part, the long div, provides a place to display information regarding mouse, screen, browser, and elements. All right. So that's this second div. And when you look at it right now, literally it's just got a bunch of empty information in it. But it has IDs set up with it, so when you start to manipulate the page and look at the different stuff that's on there, then you will be able to do some manipulation with it. And we're in chapter 10. This is web page manipulation. So notice as I'm moving the mouse around, all the stuff that's changing here. See that? Screen size. Even if I flex the screen, it's set to 1366 by 768 by default. So some of the stuff that's in there isn't going to change, in other words. Not sure why I'm not getting the image there, but I'm not. Okay. All right, so you can see the different information as we work our way through here. And the element type, as I'm working my way down the page, you can also see what's going on in there. Okay. All right, so that's dynamically manipulating the entire web page. The next thing that's discussed in here is how to dynamically manipulate elements that are on a web page. And that starts on page 282 in the book. So what you'll notice in here is you can add page elements dynamically using either JavaScript or jQuery. You can remove page elements, and you can replace elements in jQuery or insert elements in jQuery. All right. You can even go in and dynamically add and remove classes from elements, typically with jQuery. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll look at one more example here. Talk a little bit more, look at one more example, and that'll put this chapter to rest, so to speak. So they mention here, says often you will need to know all the elements that belong on a web page. You will not know until the user logs in or until something happens. So you must be able to add elements on the fly in your jQuery and JavaScript code. They mentioned there's several ways to add HTML elements dynamically. The most basic is to use the inner HTML element. And they show us a couple of examples right here. It says the following code sets the contents of an existing object to a new paragraph element, actually to two paragraphs elements. The problem with this method, as it says, is it lends itself to really ugly string statements like the one that's shown here. So JavaScript provides a way to create DOM objects and then append them to the parent object. The document.createElement, which is what is shown down here, allows you to create an element object, and the document.createText node allows you to create the text node that's part of it. Then you can use the append child element to append the newly created elements and nodes. So if we look at the example right here, okay, what are we doing? Well, first we're creating a new paragraph element. Then we're creating text that's going to eventually go into that paragraph element. Then we're taking that text that we just created and we're appending it to our paragraph. And then we're appending that paragraph to our document itself, all right, to the document object. Now they mentioned it takes a little bit more code, but the code is safer. And the upside of creating objects is that you have an actual DOM object that you can use to manipulate, add things, remove things, etc. to it. So the next set of code that you see here with an image that's on the bottom of page 282 and the top of page 283, it allows you to add an image element and then sets the source and height attributes before appending it to an existing object. All right? All right. Now, as it says, you can apply the same inner HTML shortcut that JavaScript has in jQuery by using the .html method, which will get or set that string. All right? So they mentioned, they say that this method has the same type of limitations, so it should be used sparingly. The better method is to create a new jQuery object and append it. So they show this in here. So they're creating a new jQuery object, and then, as it says, they're going to add text to it using the following. Then they come in and append that element, all right, to one or more existing elements using this. So it adds this paragraph that we just created to all div elements. Then they've got another example down below here. And this example creates a new jQuery object with an image element in the set and then adds it to every one of the li elements. jQuery also has an append to target method, which allows you to append an object to another object. It works like append, but as they mentioned, in reverse. It's called from the child object and not the new parent. Well, not only is it important to be able to add elements to a page, but it's important to be able to remove elements from a page. And the most basic way of doing this, as mentioned on the top of page 284, is to get the parent object and then set the .inner HTML equal to double quote, or the empty string. Or to call the .html passing double quote, for jQuery objects. Either way erases all the content inside the parent and removes any child elements. In JavaScript, you can also call the remove child on the parent element. So the example that they give right here, you've got the following code gets an element with an ID of container, removes a child with an ID of paragraph A. All right, those are both done in JavaScript. jQuery has two different methods to remove elements. The first is the empty, which is the equivalent to the HTML like this. With empty, as it says, all child elements in text are removed. The second is remove followed by a selector, which removes elements based only on the original query and any optional selector. If no selector is specified, the elements from the original query are removed. So if you wanted to remove all div elements, this would be a way to do it. If you specify a selector, child elements that match that will be removed. So if I only want to remove paragraphs that are inside of div elements, I could use this. Finally, jQuery provides one additional method that is useful for removing elements, and that's the Detached Selector method. It works like the remove, but there is one important difference. The actual DOM element is not deleted, even though the elements are removed from the parents. You still have the elements in the existing jQuery object, and then you can insert them back in the DOM at another location. Kind of like a cut and paste, I guess. So they show an example on the page here, and this is on the bottom of the book on page 284, where the author says the following code detaches all paragraphs from one element and appends them to another element. All right, there we go. Finally, replacing elements in jQuery. I shouldn't say finally. Replacing elements in jQuery. You can use three methods to replace elements in jQuery. The simplest is the .html that we've already looked at. Hopefully you've noticed it's good for replacing the contents of an existing element with completely new content. And that's what they show in the first example right here. Another method is to use the .replaceAllTarget method, and there's an example of that down here. In this example, we're replacing all div elements in parent B with span elements from parent A. Finally, there's a replace with that you can see down here, up here I guess now, and it's on around the middle of page 285. That's the opposite of replace all. The replace with function replaces the elements in the current set with the content specified. So the example that where the mouse is resting right here, that will replace all div elements with a single blank div. All right, inserting elements in jQuery. Another important feature of jQuery is the capability to easily insert elements into existing content. All right, there's before and there's after methods. The after method allows you to specify an element that should be inserted after each element in the current jQuery object set. In this first example that we see right here, what we're doing is we're inserting a new paragraph after the third paragraph in the document. The before method allows you to specify an element that should be inserted before each element. So in that second example, the one that you see right here, we're inserting a paragraph before the third P element in the document. As mentioned in the note on the top of page 286 in the text, both the after and before methods allow you to pass in multiple objects to insert. And they're done in a comma-separated list. All right. jQuery makes it easy to add, remove, and toggle classes on and off. Classes are added with the add class method. So this would add a class of active to all span elements. Classes are removed using the remove class element. So that would remove it. You can also remove with no class name, which removes all classes from elements. So if I want to remove every class, assuming there are multiple classes in one or more paragraphs, I can use that. Sometimes we don't want to remove things. We want to toggle the visibility to make things appear, disappear, show, not show, whatever it happens to be. So a way of changing the look and feel of web pages is to toggle the visibility of elements. You can do this by setting the display property to none or to double quote. And that's typically the way that you do it in JavaScript. But in jQuery, as mentioned on the top of page 287, you typically use hide if you want something to disappear and show if you want it to appear again. But one problem with using hide is the element no longer takes up any space on the page. All right, literally it's gone. So if you want the element to be invisible, but you want it to still maintain its position on the page, then you'd come in and you'd set its opacity to 0, okay, which means that it's totally transparent. If you want to make it visible again, set the opacity back to 1, which would make it opaque. All right. The next example on pages 287, 288, 289, 290, and 291. In this example, again, we're starting with a basic web page and then dynamically adding, modifying, and removing elements based on user interactions. The purpose of the example is to get you going on adding content dynamically as well as accessing properties of existing elements and manipulating the content, visibility, and classes. So if we look at this example, this is web element manipulation, it looks like. So as you can see, what we're doing here is we're having things appear and disappear. Okay. Now notice it says fade, and we're giving it an opacity. We're making it fade, but not disappear. Okay. The code for this is shown in listing 10.4, 10.5, and 10.6 on pages 290, 291, and 292. And about the last thing that's discussed in the chapter here, starting on the bottom of page 292 in the text, talks about dynamically rearranging elements on a page. And this is the author speaking. One of the coolest interactions that you can make with web pages is to rearrange elements based on user interaction. For instance, you can make page elements bigger or smaller or change their page position. One way you can do this, and you should have learned this, at least this topic should have been broached with you in the 157 class, and that is the z-index. Remember that the z-index is a CSS property that specifies the position of an element in respect to other elements. The higher the z-index value, the more in the foreground it will be, and the lower the z-index value, the more in the background it will be. So the last example that they show on the page here that goes from pages 293 to 299 says you learn the process of using JavaScript and jQuery to move, resize, and rearrange images. You use images because they're one of the most commonly rearranged elements. You can apply these same things to any other HTML element. So the actual code is in figures 10.7, 10.8, and 10.9 on pages 297, 298, and 300. Let's take a quick look at that if we can. Again, it's not showing me any images, and I'm not sure why. Yeah, it's because I don't have the images folder. So, there's the images folder. Let's just copy that thing in to our chapter 10 stuff. So we'll paste it in there. Now let's see what happens when we take a look at it. Still not showing it. Oh, and I know what it is. So we'll have to open this up for chapter 10. And we'll have to open this. Let's take a look at the way that this is shown here. I think we don't want slash images. We just want images with a copy here that I made. So let's see if that fixed it. There we go. All right, moving them to the left, pretty obvious. To the right, making an image bigger, making an image smaller, stacking images, flipping images, tiling images. So there's a lot of neat effects that you can do with this. So this particular chapter taught the reader how to access attributes, properties, methods, and other parts of objects, and to allow you to apply them interactively and dynamically to a web page. So the last chapter that I'm going to go through in just a couple minutes, believe it or not, is one of the easier chapters because it's a lot of review. It's things that we've had already. And what I mean by that, let's move this up a bit. I don't know if this will work or not, but all right, nope. Okay. I don't like this new tool. All right. So the last chapter that we'll go through, which is a fairly short chapter, is working with window, browser, and other non-page web or non-web page elements. We'll be back with that one shortly.